When I first set foot on my little patch of land, I didn't think of it as an investment. I thought of it as home. It wasn't big, it wasn't fancy, and it definitely wasn't worth millions of dollars like the houses further down the road. But it had something none of those luxury homes had: a creek. That creek wasn't just water running through the dirt, it was alive. Every morning, sunlight bounced off its surface like gold. Birds nested in the trees nearby. Frogs croaked after sunset, and when it rained, the creek came alive, carrying fresh, cool water downstream, keeping the ground balanced and healthy. Neighbors would walk past my property and scoff. "Why'd you buy land with a ditch running through it?" one man once asked, shaking his head. I just smiled. To me, that ditch was nature's heartbeat. But the HOA didn't see it that way. The Homeowners Association, a group of self-important neighbors who thought they were city planners, engineers, and gods all rolled into one, decided the creek was a problem. They said it looked messy. They said it was unsafe. What they really meant was it didn't fit their perfect uniform image of suburban paradise. One evening, I got a letter taped to my door. The HOA had voted unanimously. The creek was to be sealed off. I remember standing there with the paper in my hand, my chest tightening. Sealed off? You don't seal off a creek. It's not a pothole. It's a living system, a natural flow. The next week, heavy machinery rolled in. Bulldozers, cement trucks, men in orange vests. I ran out and confronted them. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted over the roar of engines. "Filling it in," one worker replied flatly, pointing to the order in his hand. I tried to stop them. I went to HOA meetings. I warned them. This creek keeps your yards from flooding. It keeps your million-dollar basements dry. You block it, and you're going to regret it. They laughed. They laughed in my face. "Sir, with all due respect," one smug board member sneered, "we've consulted professionals. You clearly don't understand modern development." And just like that, the trucks dumped tons of wet, gray concrete into the creek. I stood there helpless as the heart of my land was choked to death under slabs of cement. The frogs, the birds, the running water, gone. At first, it seemed like nothing changed. The houses gleamed under the sun. Perfect lawns, shiny cars, neighbors sipping wine on their porches. They thought they'd won, but I knew. I knew nature doesn't take insults lightly. And then, the first storm came. The sky grew dark that night, thunder shaking the windows, lightning splitting the clouds open. Rain hammered the ground, pouring faster and heavier than usual. Normally, the creek would have carried it away, guiding it out of the neighborhood like a silent guardian. But this time, there was nowhere for the water to go. I woke up at midnight to a strange silence. Then I heard it, the sound of rushing water. I stepped outside, and what I saw froze me in place. The street in front of the million-dollar homes was beginning to look like a river. The rain didn't just fall, it poured. It was one of those relentless downpours that turns the air thick, the kind that drowns out every other sound. The gutters along the street overflowed within minutes, spilling water like broken fountains. Normally, the creek would have carried the excess downstream. The system was simple, elegant, and natural, but the creek was gone. Instead, water rushed across the neighborhood like a predator searching for weakness. It pooled in the neatly trimmed yards of the million-dollar homes. It slid down driveways, filling cracks, seeping under garage doors. I stood on my porch, rain soaking through my clothes, watching it all unfold. I could almost feel the ground choking, struggling to breathe under the tons of concrete that suffocated it. Across the street, one of the HOA board members, Mr. Denton, stumbled out of his front door holding an umbrella. He squinted into the storm, waving his flashlight at the rising water like he could command it to stop. "Everything's fine," he shouted at a neighbor who was already panicking, stacking sandbags in front of her garage. "It's just a heavy storm, nothing to worry about." But even from where I stood, I could see the panic in his eyes. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the whole neighborhood for a split second. And in that moment, I saw it. The water wasn't just pooling anymore. It was moving. It was creeping higher, faster, seeking new paths, cutting through flower beds and manicured lawns like they were paper. The million-dollar homes, built low to the ground for that perfect grand estate look, were the first to feel the invasion. Water lapped against their foundations, gurgling as it slipped into tiny cracks. I whispered under my breath, "This is only the beginning." By midnight, the streets had become streams. Cars sat half-submerged, their alarms screaming into the storm like wounded animals. Neighbors rushed around helplessly, trying to save potted plants, outdoor furniture, anything that floated, and then came the smell. It wasn't just rainwater anymore. The blocked creek had caused the storm drains to back up. Sewage mixed with floodwater, turning the once pristine neighborhood into a foul swamp. Children cried from inside houses as parents desperately tried to block doors with towels and boards. The HOA president, Mrs. Whitaker, stood in the middle of the chaos, barking orders that no one listened to. "This is temporary. Stay calm," she screamed, her voice shrill against the thunder. But her perfect hair was plastered to her face, her designer shoes ruined, her million-dollar smile cracking. I stayed on my porch, higher ground keeping me safe for now. My creek would have carried all of this away. But sealed under concrete, nature had no choice but to take it back, violently. By 3 a.m., the water had reached inside the first basement. A scream echoed through the storm as one homeowner discovered his wine cellar destroyed, bottles floating like dead fish. Another neighbor's luxury SUV short-circuited, headlights flickering before dying completely. And then, silence. Not outside. The storm still raged. The silence came from the people. One by one, they realized this wasn't just a bad night. This was the start of something far worse. I leaned against my doorway, the rain finally easing up, and whispered to myself, "You killed the creek. Now the creek is killing you." But even I didn't know how bad it was going to get, because the storm had left behind more than water. It had left behind weakness. Cracks in foundations, soil turned to sludge, basements filled to the brim. The million-dollar homes were no longer sitting proudly on solid ground. They were sitting on a swamp. Morning arrived, but it didn't feel like morning. The sky was still gray, heavy with dampness, as if the storm had left its shadow behind. Puddles reflected broken tree branches, trash cans floated like tiny boats, and the once proud neighborhood now smelled of rot and sewage. I stepped outside, my boots sinking slightly into the soggy earth. My home was safe. The higher elevation spared me from the worst. But the HOA's grand row of million-dollar homes? They looked wounded. Lawns were chewed up, driveways cracked under the pressure of water, and mud clung to every surface like an infection. Neighbors shuffled around in disbelief, clutching their ruined belongings. I spotted Mr. Denton, the board member from the night before, standing on his porch, phone pressed to his ear. He was shouting at someone, probably insurance. "Yes," I said, "flood damage." "The basement is full." "No, I didn't ignore anything. It's not my fault." He stopped abruptly when he noticed me watching. His face flushed, anger twisting his features. He turned his back on me, slamming his door. Typical. By noon, the HOA had called an emergency meeting. They set up folding chairs in the community center, though most of them were still damp and smelled faintly of mold. The air buzzed with tension. Mrs. Whitaker, the HOA president, stood at the front. Her immaculate appearance was gone, hair frizzed, designer suit stained. Still, she tried to hold authority. "This was an unprecedented storm," she said, her voice sharp but trembling. "No one could have predicted this. The flooding is temporary. Crews are already on their way to assess damages." A man in the back stood up, water stains still visible on his expensive slacks. "My basement's destroyed. My furnace is gone, my walls are soaked, my kids were terrified all night. You said sealing the creek would make this place safer." Murmurs erupted. Faces turned red. Fists clenched, Mrs. Whitaker tried to keep control. "It's just bad luck. Once we dry out, everything will go back to normal." But she was wrong, because while they argued about insurance and repairs, Something far more dangerous was happening beneath their feet. The floodwater hadn't just filled basements, it had soaked deep into the ground. The soil, once solid and steady, was now mush. The weight of the million-dollar homes pressed down on that weakened earth, and slowly, invisibly, it began to shift. Cracks appeared in walls, hairline at first. Floors creaked louder than usual. Doors refused to close properly. Some homeowners dismissed it as minor storm damage. But I knew better. Nature doesn't just strike once. It erodes, it weakens, it waits. That night, I heard shouting again, this time from the Hendersons' house. Their marble-tiled kitchen floor had dipped ever so slightly like a shallow bowl. Water hadn't just flooded them. It had changed the ground beneath their home. I walked back inside, sat at my table, and stared at the concrete scar where my creek once ran. If the HOA had left it alone, the water would have drained naturally. Instead, they had turned the neighborhood into a fragile stage, one bad storm away from collapse. And deep down, I felt it. The storm wasn't the climax. It was just the opening act. The real disaster hadn't even started yet. By the third day after the storm, the neighborhood had begun to rot from the inside out. At first, the damage looked cosmetic: muddy lawns, water-stained walls, ruined carpets. But the deeper you looked, the worse it got. The Hendersons hired a contractor to check their sagging kitchen floor. He knelt down, knocked on the tile, and frowned. "This isn't just storm damage," he muttered. "The foundation's shifting." Those words spread through the community like wildfire. Foundation shifting. For million-dollar homes, that phrase was a death sentence. One by one, other families discovered similar horrors. Cracks spiderwebbing up drywall, windows that wouldn't close, floors tilting just enough that marbles rolled to the corner on their own. And then came the smell. Damp wood, mold creeping silently into basements, mixing with the stench of stagnant water outside. What had once been a pristine showcase of wealth was turning into a swampy graveyard of real estate. I watched from my porch as arguments erupted in driveways. Insurance adjusters came and left quickly, shaking their heads. Floodplain damage. Not covered, they said again and again, leaving homeowners pale and desperate. The HOA, of course, tried to save face. At their next meeting, Mrs. Whitaker slammed a stack of papers on the table. "We are not responsible for this. The storm was an act of God. The creek had nothing to do with it." But someone finally snapped. Mr. Alvarez, whose luxury SUV had been ruined, stood up and pointed a shaking finger at her. "You told us filling in the creek would increase property values. You said it would make our homes safer. And now, my family is sleeping in a hotel while my house sinks into the mud." Voices rose in fury. People demanded accountability, refunds, resignations. Mrs. Whitaker's confident mask began to crack. That's when I decided to speak. I wasn't part of the HOA, but word of my warnings had already spread. When I walked into that meeting, soaked boots leaving muddy prints on their polished floor, the room fell silent. "I told you," I said, voice steady but sharp. "The creek wasn't just decoration. It was nature's drainage system. You choked it, and now nature is choking you." Some faces turned guilty, others furious. But no one could deny the truth anymore. The next day, lawsuits started flying. Homeowners against the HOA. The HOA against contractors. Everyone blaming everyone else, while the ground under their feet quietly sank further into ruin. And then, it happened. On a humid evening, the Carter residence, one of the grandest homes on the block, gave a deep, groaning sound like a beast waking from a nightmare. Neighbors ran outside just in time to see part of the front yard collapse inward. The soil had liquefied beneath it. The Carter's porch cracked in half, dragging the columns down into the muck. Screams echoed through the night. Children cried. Emergency crews arrived, but even they couldn't stop the earth from swallowing what didn't belong. That night, fear spread faster than any storm. The homeowners finally realized this wasn't going to get better. This was only going to get worse. The million-dollar homes, Once symbols of pride and success were becoming cages, sinking, cracking, and breaking apart with every passing day, and still, the HOA refused to admit defeat, but nature wasn't done yet. News vans showed up before dawn. Bright lights cut through the misty streets as reporters shoved microphones into the faces of angry, exhausted homeowners. Luxury homes sinking into the ground. One headline screamed on the evening broadcast. Another station called it the suburban swamp disaster. For years, this neighborhood had been the pride of the city. Glossy brochures, sky-high property values, backyard parties with champagne under twinkling lights. Now, those same backyards were half submerged in mud, and champagne bottles floated in basements like debris after a shipwreck. The HOA tried to spin it. Mrs. Whitaker, still clinging to her role as president, stood in front of the cameras with her forced smile. This was an act of nature, nothing more. The community remains strong, and repairs are already underway. But as she spoke, a cameraman zoomed in on the Carter house, the one with the collapsed porch. Behind her, workers were digging out a luxury sedan swallowed up to its windows in muck. The contrast was humiliating. The cracks inside the HOA widened. Board members accused each other of corruption, of ignoring warnings, of pocketing money. At one heated meeting, Mr. Denton threw down a stack of emails. "You knew this could happen," he barked at Mrs. Whitaker. "We were told the creek was essential drainage. You buried the report." Gasps filled the room. She denied it, of course, but the damage was done. The betrayal was out in the open. While they tore each other apart, nature tightened its grip. Mosquitoes swarmed the stagnant water, spreading sickness and sleepless nights. Mold bloomed across once flawless walls in sickly green and black patches. The smell of rot became unbearable. What was once luxury now reeked of decay. Neighbors stopped speaking to each other. The same people who used to boast about community barbecues now slammed their doors shut. Trust had drowned in the same water filling their basements. And me? I sat on my porch, watching it unfold like a slow-motion tragedy. My home, perched on higher ground, remained untouched. But every day, I looked at the slab of concrete where the creek once flowed and thought, this is the price of arrogance. Then the unthinkable happened. On the 7th night after the storm, heavy rain returned, not as fierce as the first, but enough. The already weakened ground couldn't take it. At 2 a.m., the rumble began. This time it wasn't just one house. 3 homes side by side shifted violently. Cracks split driveways in half. Patio furniture slid into newly formed sinkholes. One family barely escaped as their back deck collapsed, swallowed whole by the swamp. Sirens blared, lights flashed, neighbors screamed. Reporters swarmed the next morning, calling it suburbia's sinking scandal. Property values didn't just drop, they plummeted off a cliff. $1-million homes couldn't sell for half their worth. Some couldn't sell at all. Banks froze mortgages. Lawsuits piled higher than sandbags. And in the middle of it all, the HOA still refused responsibility. But the neighborhood didn't need a judge or jury anymore. It had nature, and nature had already delivered its verdict. The neighborhood was no longer a neighborhood. It was a battlefield, humans versus nature, and the humans were losing. By the second week, the once pristine streets looked like veins of mud. Cars sat abandoned, their wheels half buried. Lawns, once trimmed to perfection, were jungles of weeds thriving in the swampy soil. The proud white fences leaned at awkward angles, sinking inch by inch. But the true terror was inside the homes. Families slept in fear, listening to the groans of their $1-million walls. Floors buckled in the night, and new cracks appeared each morning. Some homeowners taped them over like Band-Aids, pretending the wounds weren't fatal. Others simply gave up, packing what they could and fleeing, leaving their investments to rot. The HOA was finished. Mrs. Whitaker stopped showing her face. Rumors spread that she had quietly moved out, abandoning the very people she once ruled over. Board members turned on each other in lawsuits, their friendships collapsing as quickly as their homes. And then came the final storm. It wasn't the biggest storm, not compared to the first one. But it didn't need to be. The land was already ruined, the soil a sponge with nothing left to give. I remember standing on my porch that night, watching the sky bruise black. Lightning flashed, illuminating the ghostly shells of the houses below. The rain came steady, then harder, then relentless. At 1:37 a.m., the ground finally gave way. I heard it before I saw it, a deafening roar, like thunder exploding from the earth itself. The Henderson house tilted, its foundation splitting apart with a sound like bones breaking. Glass shattered, walls tore, and then, in one horrifying moment, the entire structure leaned sideways and collapsed into the swamp with a sickening splash. Screams pierced the night. Neighbors ran through the rain, clutching children, dragging suitcases, abandoning everything they had once been proud to own. One by one, more homes cracked, shifted, and broke, until the street looked less like suburbia and more like a graveyard of wealth. The media returned in droves, their cameras capturing what was now undeniable, an entire neighborhood, destroyed not by chance, not by fate, but by arrogance. Headlines called it the HOA catastrophe, and through it all, I stood safe. My modest house on higher ground, untouched. My warning ignored. My creek, murdered beneath concrete, had risen for revenge. In the days that followed, bulldozers came, not to build, but to bury. The subdivision was condemned. Families scattered, lawsuits dragged on, fortunes disappeared. What had once been worth millions now sat abandoned, a swamp reclaiming its territory. Sometimes I walk down there. The silence is haunting. You can still see the skeletons of houses jutting out of the muck, their driveways leading nowhere, their windows staring blankly like hollow eyes. And I think of the day they laughed at me. I told them you can't silence nature. You can't choke a creek and expect it to forgive you. Nature always remembers, and when it strikes back, it doesn't care how expensive your house is or how many zeros are in your bank account. The HOA turned my creek into concrete. Now their million-dollar homes are sinking, swallowed whole, lost forever in the swamp they created. And that is justice.